Hello and welcome to another Sunday Superversive live stream. I am not your host today. Instead, I am introducing my most loyal Watson, Anthony Marchetta, who is talking about something near and dear to his heart, the Battle of Gettysburg. Take it away, Anthony.
Hello, everyone. Uh, so, Gettysburg and the Civil War. Civil War has been a topic that has interested me for a long time. Uh, Sorry, I'm pulling up the live chat, which immediately got the background video playing until I muted it. Okay. Anyway, so Civil War has been an interest of mine for a long time. Uh, all good red-blooded men need to become either fascinated by World War II or the Civil War at some point in their lives. It is just a fact. It's science. I have been interested in both, but more so the Civil War. I took a college. I have not gotten like a degree in it or anything like that, but I did take a college course on the Civil War. The course was definitely leftist slanted. However, if you could ignore the spin and take the facts out of it, I think I did still learn some things in that course. I have read James McPherson's Battle Cry of Freedom, which is considered to be the best one volume work on the Civil War ever written. And recently, I've been going through Shelby Foote's volumes on the Civil War. So, for those who don't know, Shelby Foote has written what is generally considered to be the best multi volume narrative work on the Civil War ever written. Shelby Foote is an interesting figure. He is not a historian, in any sense of the word. So, he was a novelist and a hobbyist. I'm not even sure if he has a college degree, I can't recall. He certainly is not, he never got any degree in Civil War studies or anything like that. His book was criticized, in my opinion, incorrectly for not having footnotes because he never called it a history book. He was a novelist who was writing a narrative history of the Civil War. That is not to say he included any facts in it that were false, but his primary concern was telling the story in an entertaining way. So footnotes break this up. It was not an academic work. It was not for academics. It was not meant to be academic. What it was meant to do is humanize the story. Foote himself is an interesting guy. He is a Southerner who is, of course, like all good Southern men, a great admirer of Jefferson Davis, Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson. But if you read him, you'll also see that he was an admirer of Grant, Sherman, which is really fascinating because Southerners tend to really hate Sherman, but he became an admirer of William T. Sherman. That is the man who was the leader of the infamous March to the Sea from Atlanta and the destruction of South Carolina. Uh, and he believed that Abraham Lincoln was a genius. Uh, he spoke very, Shelby Foote spoke very, very, very strongly against slavery, as you would expect. I probably, unless he were from like the 1800s, a contemporary, I probably would not read him if he wasn't staunchly anti-slavery. I would just consider him a disgusting human being, but he did. He was incredibly anti-slavery, uh, and yet he supported the South in the Civil War. So, when asked about it, he said that if the Civil War were run today, he would fight. He probably would fight for the South, and he would have fought for the South at the time. And he believed that they were more justified in the fighting than the North. So, he's an interesting man, a man who seems to be of contradictions until you look deeper, and then you realize it is perfectly rational and logical for him to hold the positions he does. You don't necessarily need to agree, but they make sense. You could admire someone without agreeing with them. You could believe that somebody has qualities that are worth emulating without necessarily thinking that they are right in everything that they did. And for what it's worth, I would agree with him in his admiration for Robert E. Lee. I don't know enough about Jefferson Davis to say, I don't know enough about Stonewall Jackson really to say, except that he was a genius and he was deeply religious, which I suppose in some ways is enough. But I also agree with him in his admiration of General Grant, and I agree with him, whatever you think of him morally, Abraham Lincoln was an incredibly intelligent man. Uh, and which is an interesting thing to say when you look at his perception at the time versus how it ended up. But that is another story. But that's all a prelude to talk about what I am going to be discussing, which is Gettysburg. Now, obviously I was familiar with the Battle of Gettysburg before I read Shelby Foote, because the Battle of Gettysburg is the biggest battle of the entire Civil War, one of the biggest battles. In fact, I think it might be the bloodiest battle in American history to this day, even post World War II. Uh, right? So the Civil War. So Gettysburg is and was also, and not only a very big battle, which Shiloh was as well, and Antietam was as well. And then you had the long trench warfare of Chickamauga and Chattanooga. But Gettysburg was also a momentous battle. It was an important battle. Uh, Gettysburg, in my opinion, you'll sometimes see, some revisionist history trying to underplay or overplay the importance of Gettysburg. I would agree with the general historical consensus of the decades that Gettysburg was just about as important as everybody always said it was. That is, the winner of Gettysburg was probably going to be the winner of the overall Civil War. If Robert E. Lee managed to force a victory at Gettysburg, I think it was at the very least very plausible that the South could have won the Civil War. And the North's victory at Gettysburg, while it did not end the war by any stretch of the imagination, the war dragged on for years after that point. It was the last serious Southern foray into the Northern states. The South never again threatened to seriously win. It was from that point on a war for survival that the South could not fully recover from, and that ultimately resulted in Appomattox. So, the reason I want to talk about it is after reading Foote's account of the war, which is incredibly entertaining and very readable, it made me realize that there were facts about Gettysburg that I did not know about and I did not understand at the time, and made me rethink my view of how the battle went. It made me realize that there were different heroes in the battle than I had originally known about. That there were people who were incredibly important, even critical to the battle plan, that until I read Foote's book, I had literally not heard of. And it made me realize something else. I was under the impression that Gettysburg was all but an unwinnable battle. That it was really just not realistic for the South to win this battle. That maybe at a couple of points, if they had gotten incredibly lucky, they could have forced their way to victory, but ultimately it was just not a good idea from the start, as General Longstreet, who was Lee's number 2 at the time, after the death of Stonewall Jackson particularly, pointed out. However, reading Foote's account, I realized this was not true. There were 3 different occasions on day 2 of the battle where the South came extremely close, and I mean extremely close, to breaking through the Northern lines and winning the battle. And at one point, it came down to a matter of 5 minutes. In 5 minutes, the South could have overrun the North and won the battle if they had not figured out a way to buy those 5 minutes of time and rush in reinforcements. And we are going to talk about this today. Okay, so the Civil War. Let's go into the background of the battle. General Lee comes up with an incredibly audacious plan to invade the North, right? To invade the northern states. Lee was riding an air of invincibility at this point. He was a worldwide celebrity because he had just won the Battle of Chancellorsville. Now, for those who don't know, Chancellorsville was, even now, considered to be Lee's greatest battle, his greatest victory, his greatest triumph. With a vastly outnumbered force of men, through clever tactics and expert strategy and generalship and strong delegation of good men, he managed to win an seemingly impossible battle against overwhelming odds, outnumbered, And Lee, who already had a good reputation before Chancellorsville due to battles like Second Bull Run or Second Manassas and Fredericksburg, now was just catapulted to celebrity genius status. He could do no wrong. He was admired even by the North at this point. So he comes up with this plan. The truth is that the Civil War was always kind of a long shot for the South, and they knew it. To them, it was a war for survival. It was a necessary war. In their view, if they did not go to war, the North would have destroyed them, or they would have lost their rights as people, as a country. It was a matter of life and death. They had no choice, but it was still a long shot to win. And for what it's worth, not everybody agreed with this opinion. For example, Jefferson Davis, the Confederate president, was very much against secession. He didn't think that they should do it. But after they did do it, he believed his first responsibility was to his state, not to the nation as a whole. The main difference I would summarize between the northern and southern view of the states is that the southern half of the country believed each state to essentially be an autonomous nation that was in a union with each other, that was voluntary and could be broken at any time if they chose, because each state functioned essentially as its own type of country, sort of like the European Union, but with a slightly stronger central government. Whereas the northern view of the Union was that each state just functioned as sort of like a county in a larger state, that they were parts of a larger whole, and it was that whole that was owed the primary responsibility. Now, it is worth noting that this was not always the view of all of the northern states. There was a brief and not very serious, but nevertheless real, thought to Massachusetts succeeding several decades earlier. I forget exactly why. I don't have the history at the tips of my fingers at the moment, but Massachusetts did hold a vote where they did consider seceding. It didn't come very close to succeeding, but they thought about it. So it wasn't always the view of the northern states. However, this was the primary two positions at the time of the Civil War. You know, this is how Lincoln was justifying his war to keep the nation together. This is how the southern states were justifying the rebellion, if you want to call it that, or the War of Secession, I think is a better way to put it. As a side note, I hate the term Civil War. The Civil War was not actually a civil war. A civil war is when two sides fight each other for control of the same government. In actuality, I think I favor the term the War of Southern Secession because it is accurate and neutral. It does not favor either side of the conflict, but it is a more accurate term than things like the Civil War, because it was not a civil war. Factually speaking, a civil war is when two factions of the same country fight each other for control of the government. See the Spanish Civil War for a very clear example of this. What was going on in the South could be classified as a rebellion, could be classified as something similar to what happened in the American Revolution. And I favor the War of Southern Secession. But that's an aside. So, let's go back to Gettysburg itself. We have this Battle of Gettysburg. Lee invades the North, and he has a particular strategy. His plan, and by the way, there were people who did not agree with it. Most people agreed with this, but not everybody did. In particular, of all people, the Postmaster General of the South thought that this was going to be a disaster and strongly opposed Lee's plan. But he was literally the only one, and Lee was way too much of a celebrity, so they ultimately voted against him. It is worth noting, though, that though he disagreed, he was not ridiculed or anything like that. He actually was so upset by the plan, he asked Jefferson Davis to call an emergency meeting of Congress to re-vote on the plan, and his plea was granted. Like, Jefferson Davis did take his objection seriously. They wanted to get this right, but he was defeated in the vote again by the same margin, meaning he was the only man who voted against Lee's invasion of the North. Now, Lee had a plan. Lee's plan was, if the war becomes so unpopular in the North, then Lincoln will be voted out of office for the Copperheads, which were the anti-war party in the North. the Democrats, right? And they would negotiate with the South and end the Civil War. Lincoln was not willing to negotiate. He had thrown together something that was very similar to his later 10% plan and had offered it to the South. The South's universal reaction to this was that it was an insulting plan. Lincoln's 10% plan was basically, if you rejoin the country, then all you need are 10% of your population to vote in favor of joining the Union, and you will be readmitted as full states, and we will give amnesty to all Confederate officials. This was the plan that Lincoln was intending to do during Reconstruction, and then he was assassinated. But when he first proposed this to the South, the Southern reaction was, "This is an insult." So the idea was, okay, number one, you talk about forgiving us but you don't need forgiveness if you did nothing wrong. Number two, your plan involves 90% of the population being ruled over by 10% of the population, which is exactly the reason that we were leaving in the first place, that you were elected with no Southern votes, which is true, by the way. Lincoln was elected president with no Southern electoral votes. So you're essentially just making that same problem again, only much, much worse. A minority vote is going to rule over us. It was a sign to them that Lincoln was not willing to negotiate, which was completely true. Lincoln was not willing to negotiate. Lincoln was not willing to treat the South as if they were their own nation with their own rights. He was treating them like a rebellious portion of the Union. So they utterly rejected this plan. And that's what led to Lee's idea. Hey, we're going to go into the North and we're going to march on Washington eventually. That was the ultimate plan. And we're going to make this war, we probably can't really win. Like, our goal isn't to take over the North. That was never the Southern goal. They never want to control the North. But maybe we can make this war so unpopular that the Lincoln will be voted out, and the new political party that comes in will negotiate an end to the war and will be our own country. Would this have worked? I mean, it's possible. Honestly, we can never really know because he lost at Gettysburg and was driven back, and the war never became quite so unpopular that Lincoln could be voted out. So we just don't know. But nevertheless, this was Lee's plan. So Lee is marching through Pennsylvania, where basically what happens is that the two sides just sort of meet in Gettysburg. The current general at the time of the Army of the Potomac, which was the main Union Army, the most powerful Union Army, and Lee's army, by the way, was the Army of Northern Virginia, which was the most powerful Confederate army. But the main body, the Army of the Potomac, was currently being led by General Meade. So I really like the way that Foote describes Meade. He describes him as somebody who had kind of a short temper, a bit of an inferiority complex. Nobody really knew, why Lincoln picked him. They said everybody sort of looked down on him. However, he says, almost in passing, except for Meade's own men. In other words, the people who actually fought for Meade knew why Meade was picked as general. When the South learned that General Meade had been picked, the prevailing attitude at the time, as they told Lee, was that they congratulated him on the North's choice of another bad general who would be easy for him to defeat. The North had gone through a series of poor generals up to that point: General McClellan, General Hooker, General Burnside, all of whom were catastrophic failures and far inferior to General Lee. The most disappointing being General McClellan, who had a good reputation and much hype and was a total disaster who lost several major battles. But the worst general was probably Burnside, and it was Hooker who was responsible for the disaster at Chancellorsville. So Lee, however, hears that General Meade is going to be the head of the Union Army, and his response is different. The reason his response is different is that in the Mexican-American War, he had fought with Meade, so he knew Meade personally. And his response to learning that Meade was head of the Army of the Potomac was, General Meade will not make any mistakes, and he will take advantage of any of ours. We need to proceed with caution. So Lee did not underestimate General Lee. Even the Union Army underestimated General Lee, or General Meade, I'm sorry, but Lee did not. Okay, so we have this battle in Gettysburg, and before the battle starts, they need to make a decision. Or at least when the battle start, I should say after the battle starts proper, before the battle starts proper, they need to make a decision. There is a frantic first day at the Battle of Gettysburg, and that's the only way I could describe it. There's almost a running gag in Foot's book how there was a poor, I believe, Corporal Howard, who was responsible for one of the disastrous retreats at Chancellorsville, and desperately keeps trying to salvage his reputation and keeps getting humiliated in the field. So the early fighting in Gettysburg is all Confederates. They surprise the Union forces, who are forced into a scrambling retreat up Cemetery Ridge. So Gettysburg is essentially it's a long series of hills, and it goes into a sort of hook shape, right? Meade called it the fish hook, and at the top of the hill there was a ridge called Cemetery Ridge, Cemetery Hill, and Cemetery Ridge. Cemetery Ridge had the round top hills at the end, Little Round Top, which becomes famous later, and Round Top, and it goes to the other end. There's an area called the Devil's Den and the Peach Orchard, but you can retreat back to the ridge, right? Cemetery Ridge is an incredibly defensible position. It's high walls, it's up a hill. You hunker down, you dig in some trenches, and it is going to be very hard to dislodge anybody from that position. Uh, so the South drives the Union back in a sort of unintentional surprise attack. They just sort of met them, but then they charged, and they were very disciplined, and the Union was taken by surprise. They drive them back to Cemetery Ridge. Now, this is where the first strange thing happens in this battle. The first point of the battle where you could go, what's going on here? So, General Ewell has the North driven back, and they're in disarray. They're frantically trying to figure out what to do, but they're panicking. They're stuck on that ridge, and they're waiting for a Confederate charge. They think it's gonna happen. It's just a matter of when. We gotta be ready. So, uh, Lee is a man who likes to delegate things to his subordinates. He is a very good delegator. Uh, he is very, very good at showing his men a certain level of respect and allowing them to operate autonomously. And it helped because that the South had extremely good generals, not just Lee. Stonewall Jackson was gone, and if he were still around, it is quite possible that the Battle of Gettysburg would have ended differently, because Stonewall Jackson was a genius in his own right. But all of the Southern generals had very strong reputations, and Lee trusted them implicitly. So General Ewell has the Union on the ropes, and he sends a message to Ewell: if practical, attack. And Ewell waits, and waits, and waits, and Ewell does not attack. Why? Well, the short answer is Ewell panicked. He got into his own head. He interpreted the message from Lee, don't attack unless practical, to mean, or attack if practical, I should say, was worded in that way, to mean only attack if you have assurance of success. It occurred to Ewell that you never have assurance of success in war. Therefore, he should probably not do anything. And wait for reinforcements. Well, he waits, and when Pettigrew's men show up with reinforcements, it is now night, which makes the attack impractical, and also the Union have fortified. So he doesn't attack. Lee goes out and checks this and is very disappointed to see Ewell does not attack. When he said if practical, he only meant if you think that you have a chance at succeeding. He did not mean only if you are certain of success. Lee was an extremely aggressive general, That was kind of his calling card. And he was a perfect contrast to Meade, who was known as an extremely defensive general. That was his calling card. So, you have Lee, you have Meade, right? You have this day one of the battle. The Union has been driven back, but I mentioned the Union has managed to fortify itself despite being in disarray. So, what happens? Well, Meade learns about what happened and he sends out one of his men. I believe he was a corporal. I could be wrong. Maybe general. Hancock. I'm gonna look that up. Hancock. Civil War. Yeah, General. General Hancock. So, General Hancock was already known as a war hero. He was. So, at that point, he already had a strong reputation. Now, this was very rare in the Union Army. The Union Army did not have a great reputation. So, but Hancock did. Winfield Scott Hancock. He was known for heroism. He was known for competence. And when he showed up, he rallied the Union, had them reorganize them, brought some reinforcements, fortified the defensive, had them dig in defensive entrenchments, and generally calmed the men down and had them fully prepared for the Confederate assault. He was expecting the Confederates to attack before the day was out and was quite surprised that they did not. But it gave the Union time to fortify their defenses. So, that is what they do. They have that fishhook shape that I mentioned with the round tops on one end and just curving on Cemetery Ridge on the other end. And they prepare for the night. Now, you have the war council at night in the Confederate camp. The Union is just, their war council is have Hancock organize the defense, and that is what he does. The Confederate war council is a little bit different. General Longstreet, who I mentioned is now Lee's number 2 after the death of Stonewall Jackson, really, really does not want to attack. Lee's response is, they're expecting us to attack, and I am going to meet them where they are. If they're expecting an attack, they will get one. Longstreet responds, General, if they're expecting an attack, that seems to me to be a great reason not to attack. We should turn and march on Washington. So, Longstreet didn't even want this battle. He says, preserve the army, march on Washington, and that will force them to attack us. And then we'll have the advantage. But Lee sees this as an opportunity. The army is all here. If they can win this battle, then they can win the entire war. They could crush the Union Army in one swoop. They'll have no opposition on the way to Washington. This is his chance. He tells Longstreet, no. That's it. We are going to attack tomorrow. And Longstreet says, okay, don't say I didn't warn you. But Longstreet is very loyal, and he did still respect Robert E. Lee. It's not like that they had any serious issues with each other. And they prepare for the attack the next day. So, Lee's attack the next day goes in a few waves. So, Longstreet, and by the way, I want to mention that Longstreet deserves some blame here, because the next day, when the Confederate Army prepares its assault, Longstreet is following Lee's orders, and he is refusing to be flexible. He is following them to the letter. And he tells them, assault on, I believe, Emmitsburg Road. So, Hood, who was Longstreet's inferior, sees the tangle of Devil's Den and Little Round Top, which are both incredibly defensible positions, and he becomes more and more convinced that they are doomed. They cannot win. And what he says is, in fact, it seemed to me that the enemy occupied a position so strong, I may say impregnable, that independently of their flank fire, they could easily repel our attack by merely throwing or rolling stones down the mountain as we approached. He sends a message to Longstreet telling him, we can't attack here, let us turn back. And Longstreet sends him a message, General Lee's orders are to attack up the Emmitsburg Road. That is his entire response. Hood sends another message, begging Longstreet, we can't do this, it won't work. Longstreet sends a second message back. He goes, General Lee's orders are to attack up Emmitsburg Road. He sends a third message. And once more, he asks Longstreet for some freedom to maneuver, to move his attack. And Longstreet denies him a third time. General Lee's orders are to attack up the Emmitsburg Road. And as Foote says, all that was lacking to complete the symbolism was a cockcrow. So finally, Hood rides down to Longstreet to talk to him in person and tell him, I don't think you understand. This attack is going to fail. It won't work. You're just throwing your men's lives away. And Longstreet says, Lee's orders were to attack up Emmitsburg Road, and that is what we are going to do. And he says, okay, don't say I didn't warn you, and he attacks up Emmitsburg Road. Now, for the record, the Emmitsburg Road attack actually didn't go that badly. So General Hood's, or Corporal Hood's, I'm not sure, but Hood's attack went fairly well. They actually managed to take Devil's Den and the Peach Orchard, and then they are stopped at Cemetery Ridge, just as Hood thought they would be, because Cemetery Ridge was impregnable. But remember, I mentioned that there were 3 different occasions where they were on the verge of taking this battle. So one of these occasions was on Little Round Top. Remember, there were two hills at the edge of the battlefield, Little Round Top and Round Top. Now, one thing I need to mention about the position, which is the main reason that I said that the Confederates had more of a chance at winning this battle than I realized. So, as I've mentioned multiple times, Cemetery Ridge is incredibly defensible, but there is a downside to this, and it is this. The Union Army was so entrenched and so unable to maneuver, essentially, and movement was so difficult, they were literally entrenched, as in they dug trenches. If one part of the Cemetery Ridge line fell and the Southern Army were able to outflank the Union, then the entire Union Army was going to be sitting ducks. So that was essentially the name of the battle. The Union Army holds the line, and if one part of it falls, all of it falls. Right? That is the name of the game here. So, you have the fighting on Little Round Top. I'm going to mention this quote from the book directly because Foote makes it sound incredibly epic and dramatic. He says, the conflict was particularly desperate on the far left, where the 20th Maine, made up of lumberjacks and fishermen under Colonel Joshua Chamberlain, a former minister and Bowdoin professor, opposed the 15th Alabama, Oates' regiment, composed for the most part of farmers. Equally far from home, Presque Isle and Talladega were each 650 crowflight miles from Little Round Top, which lay practically on the line connecting them. The men of these two outfits fought as if the outcome of the battle, and with it the war, depended on their valor, as indeed perhaps it did, since whoever had possession of this craggy height on the Union left would dominate the whole fishhook position. The blood stood in puddles in some places on the rocks, Oates said later. Now, you might know the 20th Maine because Joshua Chamberlain became a celebrity after this battle. The 20th Maine eventually ran out of ammunition and won the battle with a bayonet charge down the hill, which finally caused the Southern troops to surrender. And Joshua Chamberlain was given the Medal of Honor for his actions. He was promoted, and he was actually present at the final battle of the war, the Battle of Appomattox, where he ordered the Union to lower their colors in honor of the defeated Southern Army. So Joshua Chamberlain becomes a celebrity, essentially, as a result of this battle. He is also, by the way, quite badly wounded, and though he lives to an old age, the wound bothers him his entire life. But that's a story for another day. So this is the first point of the battle where the South actually came very close to winning. And that is Little Round Top and the defense of the 20th Maine. But the 20th Maine holds on, and manages to hold the line, and the South is driven back. Now, I say that was one point of the battle, but there are more. I'm looking for it. So, on the eastern side of the battle, we're now near the end. We're going to skip ahead a bit. The fortifications were surprisingly thin because Ewell had failed to prevent reinforcements from joining the right side. His job was to say, okay, we're going to concentrate our attack on the right side of the battle. Ewell, your job is to prevent reinforcements from joining. Ewell fails. So, we're going to go to that center of the battle now. This is the second point of the battle where the South comes very, very close to winning. And this is the point where I said they are 5 minutes from breaking through. So, the fighting is fiercest at Little Round Top, and they neglect one part of the battle. And they're about to fall. We're now closer to the middle of the Cemetery Ridge line. So, Hancock is informed of this, and he rushes over in a panic and sees what's going on. And he realizes, oh man, we messed up. We did not get enough men here. And he goes, man, they're about to overrun us. And if they overrun us, well, remember what I said. If the South gain a foothold on Cemetery Ridge, the Union Army is sitting ducks. The whole battle is right here. Hancock says, if only I have 5 minutes, just 5 minutes, I can bring in reinforcements. But without those 5 minutes, I can't do it. But then, what do I do? How do I gain those 5 minutes? And he gets an idea. He points to the Minnesota division, I think 12th Minnesota, and he says to them, all right, men, go see that flag? And he points to the Confederate flag in the middle of the fighting, and they go, yes. And he goes, get that flag. Now, the Minnesota division knew what was happening here. This was a suicide charge. Their job was to charge into the Confederate Army and delay them long enough for reinforcements to arrive. They were not really intended to actually get the flag. They did not get the flag, but they got Hancock not only 5 minutes, but 10 minutes. In 10 minutes, he manages to bring back the reinforcements, fortify that section of Cemetery Ridge, and just in time beat back the Confederate assault. So, the day is saved there for the Union Army. Now, we get one more time that the Confederates have a shot at breaking through. And this is what I was saying earlier. The eastern side of the army. So the fortifications are thin because Ewell had failed to prevent reinforcements from joining the right side. Ironically, this worked in the Confederates' favor. All of a sudden, they realized that for the first and only time in the entire battle, they actually outnumbered the Union Army at this point of the battle. It was their best chance of the entire battle to take the Cemetery Ridge. And they go for it. The outnumbered Union, however, realizes the importance here. They are like, oh crap, this is the battle. Bradford Walker says there's a marker where the Minnesota unit got wiped out on the battlefield. I visited it in 1990 when I was a Boy Scout on my way to Fort A.P. Hill for the National Jamboree. Yeah, that Minnesota unit, not enough people noticed. They basically saved. It was, by the way, the 1st Minnesota Volunteer Infantry Regiment. They basically saved the Battle of Gettysburg, right? Almost single-handedly due to their heroism. So they deserve all of the credit in the world for what they did. Now, you go to the eastern side of the battle. The Union Army, for the first time, is outnumbered, but they realize the importance here. They realize, oh crap, this is it. If they take this part of Cemetery Ridge, we lose. Battle over. So they fight hard. And they manage to survive long enough for the reinforcements to come, because of one particular stroke of luck. the commanding officer in charge of this part of the battle, through sheer coincidence, just so happened to be a civil engineer in peacetime. And he created a system of trenches that were so clever and difficult to break through that despite the fact that they were outnumbered, they managed to hold the line in these cleverly constructed trenches long enough for Hancock to bring his reinforcements over to the east. And once again, just barely, the Gettysburg Cemetery Ridge line holds. I really want to emphasize here that how close all three occasions were to losing the battle and potentially losing the war. We are talking that the entire Civil War potentially, we don't know for sure, but there's a very good chance of this, was a matter of 5 minutes from Confederate victory and a suicide charge by the 1st Minnesota Volunteer Infantry Regiment, saving the defensive line, and the clever defensive trench formation, saving the line on the eastern side along with Hancock's last-second reinforcements. So, night falls, the fighting ends, and that's the end of Day 2 of Gettysburg. And what's fascinating about the end of Day 2 is that both sides had very good reason to believe that essentially what they were doing was working. General Meade's perspective, he holds a council of war, talks to all of his generals, and asks them, and gives them several options. We could retreat, we could attack, we could do a sort of in-between maneuver where some of us attack and some of us stay behind, right? Or we could do what we did today and just hold the line. And he holds a vote, and the winner of the vote is hold the line, don't do anything different. And if you think about it, this makes sense. Cemetery Ridge was an incredibly defensible position, and from their perspective, against incredibly fearsome Confederate assaults, and they had managed to hold the Cemetery Ridge line. Now you have a night, some time to fortify and prepare, get things ready for the next day. So why do anything differently? It seems like the Cemetery Ridge line was working, so let's keep it that way. Besides, the Confederates were much weaker because they lost more men in the Day 2 fighting. And they had a smaller army to begin with, so if anything, Cemetery Ridge was going to be even easier to defend the next day. Now you go to the Confederate perspective. If you're the Confederates, you look at what happened on Day 2 and you go, okay, so we didn't break the line here, but you know what? Cemetery Ridge, for all how defensible it was, we came really, really close, and they did, on 3 separate occasions, to breaking through Cemetery Ridge. Surely, and Lee had not used a lot of his army. Like, he had a lot of reserves, believe it or not. General Pickett's brigade had finally arrived at the battle, which was going to be a lot of fresh men, which Lee thought would be the difference. It's like, hey, they've all been fighting. I have fresh men that have just arrived, right? We came really close yesterday. If we just do it again today, but with our fresh men and with more men, then considering how close we came the other day, it's gonna work, right? Like, we're gonna break through. General Longstreet knew. Longstreet, who was already against the attack on the first day and perhaps felt a little bit guilty for not protesting stronger against it, wasn't going to make that mistake this time. And he said very clearly, General Lee, you cannot attack tomorrow. If you attack tomorrow, it will be a massacre. You won't win. We will lose this battle. We need to leave and go to Washington while we still have an army. Make them attack us. If we charge up Cemetery Ridge, it is too defensible. They now have a night to prepare. They'll know that we're coming. It will fail. We will fail. Don't do it. And Lee says, no, I'm gonna do it. Now, Shelby Foote doesn't mention this, but in James McPherson's Battle Cry of Freedom, they suggest that Lee was ill, and perhaps quite seriously ill, with, a fairly serious flu. Uh, but either way, he does listen to Longstreet's advice. He doesn't feel, Lee doesn't have a huge ego about him. It's not like he's disrespected. He demotes Longstreet. He hears Longstreet out, and then he says, "We're gonna attack anyway." Uh, that was Lee's personality. Lee was the attacking general. Meade was the defensive general, and it was going to be offense versus defense. And General Pickett had arrived, so Pickett was the man who was going to lead the charge up Cemetery Ridge, right? So, this is the famous Day 3 of the battle. Now, the plan here was they would try and weaken. They would start with like a small sally on the flanks, try and take some small points. This doesn't work actually at the beginning of the battle. The Union manages to repulse the early Southern attacks, but it didn't really matter much to Lee's overall plan. That was never the main goal. The main goal was always going to be Pickett's charge up the to fight the Union Army, right? So General Longstreet is looking for any excuse not to do this battle. He all but tells them don't do it. He doesn't quite say it, knowing that Lee doesn't. But he goes, "Hey, if you don't think it will work, just saying, you can definitely not do it, right? Like, just if you really, really think that they are very well defended and things are very well defended, and you can't win this charge." You should use your own judgment and not do it. Like very heavily implying that they should not do this charge. The thing about Pickett, though, was that Pickett thought that the charge was going to be a great idea. He thought that Lee was absolutely right. He thought that this would totally smash the Union center and win the war. And Pickett was a man who really wanted glory and was a big like, hey, I'm gonna get my moment in the sun and be a hero, right? So Pickett's like, nah, man, I think it's gonna work. And Longstreet, who has done everything he could at this point, is watching this whole thing with absolute disgust, going, well, here we go. So Pickett charges up the hill. Now the Union at first, they're leveling volleys at each other, and actually the volleys are missing quite a bit due to the smoke on the battlefield. It's causing them to overshoot on both ends. When someone in the Union Army gets an idea, they go, hey, wait a minute, they're missing a lot of their shots, and also we're in trenches, and it's very hard to hit us. So why don't we just stop shooting, pretend like we ran out of ammo, then when they get close enough that we could see them, we let loose with our artillery. And they go, you know what? That's a really good idea. And that's what they do. Once again, Pickett is convinced we did it. They ran out of ammo. This is our chance. Longstreet still knows. He's like, don't do it. You're an idiot, basically. You're all going to die. But they don't listen. And the charge starts, and without even looking or really being able to see what's going on, Longstreet, quite disgusted, goes, well, he goes, yep, when he sees that the North starts shooting again, he goes, that's it. Oh no. What did you do, Ben? I have been told that I can't be heard. If there is someone in the chat who can hear me, mention it, please.
No, I can hear you. I can hear you. I'm sorry, I said that wrong. I'm just away. I can't hear you anymore. So if you when you wrap up, I won't hear it.
Okay.
Sorry.
We had a
was too vague.
miscommunication on my side. But it's all good. Okay. That's fine. I'm coming near kind of the end of the story. So Longstreet, as soon as he sees, even though he can't really see what's going on in the battle, as soon as he sees the northern guns light up, thank you, Bradford. As soon as he sees the guns light up, he realizes that they're going to lose. And sure enough, we have the famous Pickett's charge. And Pickett's men perform quite heroically. They get much, much further up the hill, some of them even making it over the ridge. This is the famous high water mark. You can find that monument at Gettysburg. I have visited it myself. It's a moving moment, but the charge fails. They're forced to retreat with whatever men they have remaining, which are very, very few. That is the Confederate center is broken. Cemetery Ridge has held. And you get some famous quotes from the center where Lee tells Pickett to gather his division and, prepare for a fighting retreat. And Pickett responds famously with, "General Lee, I have no division." One of the most moving quotes of the entire Civil War. Shelby Foote portrays it a little bit differently than James McPherson does. McPherson portrays it as Lee is absolutely devastated by this battle. I believe he mentions that Lee even tendered his resignation eventually to Jefferson Davis, which Davis refused for obvious reasons, because he was so ashamed and he took total blame for the battle. That isn't how Foote portrays it. Foote portrays it as Lee did take complete and total blame for the battle. He shouldered all of the responsibility, but he portrays it as Lee was really not in poor spirits, and he was doing this as a sort of motivational tactic. He wanted to make it very clear to his men that he did not blame them or their performance or their heroism or even the mistakes of his generals, though his generals did make a lot of mistakes in Gettysburg, on the battle, that it was not because of their fighting ability or anything that they did. It was his mistakes that were why they lost the battle. And this was a way to motivate them. Like, don't lose heart. We're just as good as we were before. We're just as strong fighters as we always were. It's just that the Union Army, I messed up. I shouldn't have done that charge. I should have listened, maybe listened to Longstreet, maybe done something else, maybe listened to you guys more. Now we need to make a retreat and try and make up for lost time as best we can. And this is where the next controversy comes in. Lincoln really, really, really wants Meade to pursue Lee. Meade, who, again, his tendency is always towards defense, sees, hey, we just won a really big battle, and we did a great job, and we forced the Confederate Army back, but honestly, we're hurting right now, and it's been raining, so the terrain is really muddy, and the Confederacy is preparing for a counterattack, and don't want to lose any more men. So Meade drags his heels, and Lee manages to get his army back into the South. Lincoln is incredibly annoyed by this. Meade, for his part, feels like he had very good reasons to drag his feet, and he's not wrong, by the way. It is very much debatable if the better move would have been to attack Lee or not. It's possible. So the argument in favor here is that if the attack succeeded, that might have ended the war on the spot, right? The argument against it is Meade's reasoning for why he wasn't ready to attack was really quite sound. Like, he would have been taking a major risk. If it were General Lee, Lee would have done it. But on the other hand, Lee had just lost at Gettysburg. So, not everything that Lee did worked, right? Just because Lee would have done it doesn't necessarily mean it would have been the right thing to do. So Meade was very annoyed that he kept getting, the government seemed to be more annoyed that he hadn't pursued Lee than happy that he had won the Battle of Gettysburg. And Meade was so annoyed by this, he actually tendered his resignation. He basically said, like, if you're going to treat me like this after I just won, got the first, basically the second major Union victory of the entire war. The first had been Vicksburg, which had been won just a day earlier, I believe. Grant had taken Vicksburg. But, I win the first major Union, uncontested, clear Union victory of the entire war. I make Robert E. Lee suffer his first major defeat of the war, and you're treating me as if I did something wrong. Well, you're not here, and I am, so you know what? If that's how it's going to be, I resign. And then the government backed off a bit because, honestly, Meade resigning or Meade being fired would have been a really bad look because he was very, very popular with the public as the hero of Gettysburg, the man who had finally defeated Robert E. Lee in battle. It was a little bit like, if any of you get this reference, Scipio Africanus defeating Hannibal. Yeah. Now, Meade was no Scipio Africanus, don't get me wrong. Although you could argue that Lee was, if not as good as Hannibal, because almost nobody was as good as Hannibal, somewhat comparable to Hannibal, but Meade was no Scipio Africanus. But in terms of the public perception, it would have been sort of like that, a supposedly unbeatable general suffers his first major defeat, right? So they could not get rid of Meade. They give their apologies. Meade stays on. However, Lincoln really wasn't happy with Meade, so what he does in response, he really doesn't want Meade leading the armies anymore. He keeps Meade as head of the Army of the Potomac, but he gets his real preferred man in charge, and that is General Grant, who had just taken Vicksburg. The taking of Vicksburg was due to Grant basically not giving up, long past the point when many, many other people would have given up. He essentially tries in 5 different ways to take Vicksburg until he finally manages it after a long siege. So Grant was the man that Lincoln knew that he needed, and he puts Grant in charge of the entire Union Army, not just the Army of the Potomac, but the General-in-Chief of all armed forces, which I believe the last person to hold that role was General Washington. So this was a high vote of confidence in Grant's favor. And to throw Meade a bone, he leaves Meade general of the Army of the Potomac and, keeps him on. But it is notable that Meade sort of loses his luster as the war continues, and it is Grant who becomes the more famous of the two in the long run. For what it's worth, I am a great admirer of General Grant. I think that Grant was, first off, actually quite a good general. Very, very effective in his own right. If you want a Scipio Africanus to Hannibal here, I think that Grant qualifies as a Scipio Africanus. I also think that Grant, like Lee for that matter, was a man of honor and a man of conviction and a man of good morals. I consider Grant to be, in some ways, the last truly great man in American history, and I would define a great man as somebody who is both great in war and great in peace. Hannibal was a great man. He was a great general, and he was a great leader of Carthage, even though the noblemen hated him and eventually drove him out. Grant was similar. He was hated by the radical Republicans. He became president and embarked, and his presidency, the radical Republicans did their best to sabotage it, but despite this, it was General Grant who embarked on the biggest anti-corruption campaign in American history up to that point, and probably since as well. He cleared out as much of the corruption in the American government as he possibly could. And for that reason alone, I consider his presidency to be more of a success than a failure, and I consider the majority of his failures, though not all of them, but the majority of his failures to be the result of the radical Republicans opposing him at every turn. It is also worth noting that Grant and Lee essentially saved the country from decades of, and possibly more, of fighting. So Lee had his orders from Jefferson Davis in the final battle of the Civil War, the Battle of Appomattox. His orders were to retreat with as much of the army as he could salvage and engage in a guerrilla war, which means, skirmishes and things like that, with the North for as long as he could. They weren't going to surrender. Lee knew that if they did this, the South would be absolutely ravaged. It would be like what Sherman did in the March to the Sea, only worse. So he defies his direct orders from his commander-in-chief. Remember, Davis is the commander-in-chief. He defies his direct orders, and he surrenders the army of Northern Virginia to Grant. And Grant, in my opinion, one of the great moments of Christian forgiveness ever, and on both ends here, He says, "You are now our countrymen again. I grant amnesty to all Confederate officials." And Joshua Chamberlain, the hero of Little Round Top, who arguably saved the Union at Gettysburg, strikes his colors. And they strike the colors of the Union Army in honor of the defeated South. And General Grant, uh, for his part, Lee was willing to go to his death because a surrender, as far as he knew, would almost certainly mean execution. Because he knew that from the point of view of the North at the time, he was a defeated rebel army, and defeated rebel commanders get executed. So that's what he figured would happen. But Grant, in a moment of all-time Christian forgiveness, in my opinion, forgives Lee, promises him and all of the Confederate leaders amnesty, and together they essentially they allow the North and the South to reunite as a country in some way that was that where even Northern generals would later appear at events together, as friends. And Grant, for the record, not only did this, but he meant it. It was not just like him saying it in the moment. Later, President Andrew Johnson wanted to start executing Confederate generals, and it was really driven by the radical Republicans in Congress. And Grant, when he heard about this, he went to bat for them. He was angry. He said, I gave my word as a gentleman, as a man of honor, as a fellow commanding officer in the Army, that they would not be harmed. I will not break my word. You can't do this." And they said, "Well, we're going to anyway." And Grant was so incensed, he threatened to resign. Well, they could not let that happen. Grant was the hero of the Civil War who had led the North to victory. So they did relent, and the Confederate leaders were not executed. Uh, but that's all a different story. Going back to Gettysburg, what was the result of the Battle of Gettysburg? Well, it did not end the war. The way that James McPherson tells it, Lee was a different man after the battle. He was more humble. He essentially organized the South for a defensive war afterward. And that is what happens. You get the battles of Chattanooga and Chickamauga, which were these brutal defensive struggles. Actually, they were trench warfare quite similar to World War One, believe it or not. Uh, so you sort of get World War One fighting in the Civil War. Meanwhile, uh, Shelby Foote describes it somewhat differently. The South were actually in good spirits. They had tried a dramatic, they had tried to figure out some sort of dramatic blow that would end the war in one fell swoop, and okay, it didn't work, right? But you know what? They had acquitted themselves very well, and Lee's army, though it was substantially smaller, had not been destroyed. It was still intact. And Lee was still around, so that was a big deal. So they figured, like, hey, I guess we'll just go back to what we were doing, which is try and survive long enough to negotiate a peace. Like, we won't get our big knockout blow. But, okay. The thing is, I don't think that the South realized just how bad a result that Gettysburg really was, and not for a reason that anybody could anticipate it. The really big problem with Gettysburg was not just the loss of men, though that was bad. It was the loss of generals. The South lost a lot of good men, a lot of intelligent men in the Battle of Gettysburg. I think it was like some absurd percentage, somewhere in the 80s or something like that, of their generals had been killed in the battle. This was a deficit of minds, of educated military officers that they pretty much were not able to replace. This was a substantial blow to the South. Lee was good, but part of the reason that Lee was good is that he was delegating, to extremely intelligent men. And this is compounded by the fact that, yes, the Union did lose a lot of good men. In particular, General Hancock, who was the hero of Gettysburg, who organized the defenses, and even made the final decision to agree to stand and fight instead of retreat. So General Hancock, who at that point was Meade's number 2, had been badly injured in the fighting, and though he survived, he was unable to participate in the rest of the war. So Hancock sort of disappears from history. Uh, I mean, not really. He shows up at the time. He runs as a Democrat for office eventually, but he disappears from the war. He's not a major player anymore. However, there was a difference in the Union Army, which is first they had more men generally, so they could keep resupplying when the South could not, and more importantly, the North was finally starting to find men who they trusted. In particular, Grant, Sherman, Meade, right? As much as Lincoln was dissatisfied with Meade, Meade had proven he could win a major battle with Robert E. Lee, which nobody else had proven up to that point. So, as the South is losing good men, Stonewall Jackson had died at Chancellorsville, uh, and they lose many men at Gettysburg. Uh, the North is finally finding its officers that are capable of winning this war. So I don't think that. I think the South's optimism after Gettysburg was misplaced. Things were in a much more dire position than they realized, and the smarter ones knew it. The smarter ones realized, wow, this is bad. Uh, because I think that there was a little bit of wishful thinking on some members of the South. They figured that eventually they would win anyway, and Gettysburg was just a chance to win faster, and now that it failed, they would just have to win slower again. In reality, what was going on was that the South was in a war that was going to be very, very difficult for them to win. They were outnumbered, they were outgunned, and the North was not willing to negotiate. So, given those facts, despite the fact that the South was fighting a defensive war, which is always easier than fighting an offensive war, it was always going to be extremely difficult for the South to win. In truth, Gettysburg was probably their last chance to really bring an end to the war, even if they didn't know it at the time. It was a realistic chance, and they did come close to winning the battle. If they had won, would Lee's wishes have come to fruition? Would Lincoln have not been reelected? Would the new president in power have been willing to negotiate a peace with them? Well, it's impossible to know, right? Because that didn't happen. But maybe, at the very least, it was certainly not implausible. So Lee's plan wasn't a bad one, right? It was a perfectly logical plan. The problem that the South had is I don't think that they realized just how much the war depended on Gettysburg. Of the success of Gettysburg. Because now that the North had found men who were willing to fight, Lee had been stripped of his aura of invincibility, they had lost so many of their generals, and that they were dwindling in numbers and ammunition, it was only a matter of time. And Lee lasted a while. He was still a good general. It was a long matter of time, but it was a matter of time. Okay, so that is my presentation on Gettysburg. That is in preparation for some exciting Civil War content that we are cooking up in the background. We're not going to announce it officially until we can confirm officially the people involved and that we're really going to do this. So, but I think that you'll all really, really enjoy it, and I certainly will, when we can officially confirm it. So stay tuned for that. It's a really fun idea for Civil War-related content. Something that I pretty much haven't seen. I haven't really seen anybody tackle it in the way that we're planning on doing it, so I'm looking forward to that. But I wanted to talk about Gettysburg because I had been reading Shelby Foote's very entertaining book, and he illuminated to me some things I had not known. Mainly that, number one, the battle was much closer than I realized. I did not know that the South came so close to breaking the Cemetery Ridgeline. I had thought that they certainly had fought heroically, but that pretty much it was an almost impregnable position, so it was never going to happen. But that isn't really true. There were 3 separate occasions in which the South came within a hair's breadth of taking the line, that with superior generalship and allocation of resources, they might have been able to take the line. But they were fighting very inflexibly, possibly due to the Lee's aura of I don't know, his aura of heroism and the hero worship that surrounded him, they really didn't want to go against Lee's opinion, even though Lee was willing to let them. But perhaps they just weren't willing to because, well, he's General Lee, so we better do what he says because he's a genius. Perhaps because Lee was sick, which was making him more inflexible than he normally would have been. But if the South had fought just a little smarter and made a few more correct decisions on day 2 of the battle, the war could have gone very differently. You know, Little Round, and the 3 main points were the eastern edge, where they barely held the line due to a clever system of trenches. The center, where the 1st Minnesota Infantry Regiment, Volunteer Infantry Regiment, engaged in a suicide charge that bought the Union 10 minutes to bring in reinforcements and save the war. And Little Round Top, where the fighting was incredibly fierce on both ends, and Joshua Chamberlain's 20th Maine manages to win the battle with a bayonet charge downhill and save the line. If any one of these sections had been overrun, Cemetery Ridge was full of sitting ducks, and being outflanked meant that it would have been very difficult for them to get away, and Lee could have gotten that decisive victory he was looking for, and then there was going to be very little stopping his march on Washington. Probably what would have happened is that Grant would have had to leave Vicksburg, which would have ruined the Union's Anaconda Plan, which was to cut off the South. They called it the Anaconda Plan. It was to cut off the Mississippi River in the South. And the Vicksburg campaign was a key part of this, so keeping Grant's army at Vicksburg was important. So if Meade's army had been crushed at Gettysburg, probably to prevent the march on Washington, Grant would have had to leave Vicksburg. And that would have been a big deal for the South. So who knows what would have happened after that point. But that isn't what happened, and that isn't the history, and instead we get the current timeline. So that's all for now. I am going to leave. We might have a blank, an empty stream for a bit before Ben gets over and shuts everything down. But have a good night, everybody.
No tethers remaining.
Welcome to Venditron 9000. Thank you for your
Tethers restored.
Processor deposit accepted. Credits awarded.
Hey, Cutter, you've got 5 minutes left in the shift. Hope you're having fun.
Processing valuable deposit. Credits transferred. Salvage
Hello.
secured. Credits deposited. Object
So,
accepted for processing. Credits deposited. Salvage deposit confirmed. Applying credit. Salvage registered. Transferring credits. Valuable object processed. Credits deposited. rewards assigned. Salvage secured. Applying credit. Deposit accepted for processing.